couple of different grants that have to do with church work. But in the context of doing that, I don't remember when it was, Jeff, but it was several years ago, we got talking about Dorothy Day. And we realized that we both had a common interest in her. I talked about how we teach Dorothy Day in the core. And Jeff told me that he was actually working on her cause for canonization. So I just, was riveted by that. And so he very kindly shared with me some of her letters. He'll share more about this whole process. But this is not just somebody who has dabbled in learning about Dorothy Day. This is someone who has really, really dug deeply into her legacy, into her letters, into her personal connections. And he shared a few of those letters with me, which I consider a great honor. And Jeff also has his ministry is called Corrigan Associates. He works with churches, he works with pastors, and that's a wonderful ministry that he has. If anybody wants to Google that, you'll find out more about it. And his wife, it's Kathy, right? Kathy is here. We just had lunch together, and it's very lovely to have you with us as well. And so I'm going to turn it over to Jeff. And I had lunch with Jeff and his wife, that this is a book that's coming out. It's a graphic book, like we would say a graphic novel, but it's not a novel. It's about the life of Dorothy Day. And it's really wonderfully, beautifully created. So I think you'll enjoy looking at the images. Thank you, Jeff.
Thanks. Thank you. I think this is a little bit like church. Everyone's sitting in the back, but that's what we're going to do, the collection. So I want to move up closer, but I'll just kind of move up to meet you, I guess. And if you have trouble seeing some of the images, as Nancy said, the images that are in this presentation are from my book, Dorothy Day, Radical Devotion, which is a graphic biography of Dorothy Day. When I first got into the canonization, this was it's about 9 years ago now. It took us 7 years to put together 2/3 of a ton of evidence for the dicastery for the cause of the saints in Rome. When I first started getting into her story, and I knew the basic story, the way you'd get from undergrad, you learn a little about Dorothy Day. She helped the poor. She was for peace. And I kind of started to get to know a little bit more about her, read her publications, and most importantly, learn her story, which is the first part of the presentation I'm going to share with you. And I thought, this would make a great musical. And then I said, well, I don't have any skill books about worker issues before. If you Google wage theft comics or migrant comics, you can read them online. They also have paper versions, but you can quickly get to them that way too. And I thought, okay, here's something we can do. So I got together with an amazing artist, Christopher Cardinale, and we started thinking of different sections of Dorothy's life and how we might tell that story. So I'm going to give you just the high points of that, but it still is worthy of a musical. But I'm also thinking now that this would make a great 8 to 10 episode Netflix series too. The publisher is Paulus Press, and they also have Paulus Productions. So I'm afraid they need to start warning those people. I'm going to be after them. So let's start Dorothy's story. And really, I got to begin Dorothy's story thinking about what J.K. Chesterton said. I know you have an institute named after Chesterton here. You probably know then his quote about Christianity. That it's not that Christianity has been tried and found wanting in some way. It's that it has been found difficult and not been tried. Now imagine if somebody really took the hardest sayings of Jesus seriously to the point that they lived it even when people thought they were crazy. Jesus tells us, I was hungry and you gave me food. I was thirsty and you gave me a drink. I was ill and in prison and you visited me. What if people really thought of people in need as if they were Jesus Christ himself? And in Matthew 25, where Jesus says that, he says that it's essential to our salvation All these folks who are Christians, wouldn't they think the thing that's most important? Jesus said, blessed are the peacemakers. We live in a world at war. Dorothy Day was someone who took that very, very seriously. So let me just share with you a little bit about her story. And it begins, I believe, a lot of people, people choose different points to tell their story. Some church folk are fond of talking about her bohemian lifestyle before she found Jesus. I'd like to start even earlier. If the clicker will let me.
Yeah.
All right. Okay, there we go. The Great San Francisco earthquake, which occurred just a few years after Chesterton's quote. Dorothy Day lived in Oakland with her parents and 4 other siblings. And her father was a sports journalist. He was the #1 in the sport, in the #1 sport at the time. Guess what the most popular sport in America was? 1916, 15, rather.
Boxing.
Boxing, anyone else?
Baseball.
Baseball. Cricket. Okay, no one's ever guessed that before. I like the boxing guess, but it's horse racing. So he was the #1 horse racing journalist at the time. So she grew up in a family of journalists. Her brothers became journalists, and she wanted to become journalists. But at that time, the earthquake happened. Dad grabbed the 2 boys. Mom grabbed the baby. They ran outside. Where's Dorothy? This poor little girl got left in the house when the earthquake happened. Now, the idea that a person who got left behind during the Great San Francisco earthquake would have some kind of affinity for people left behind by our society, I think there's a connection there. The other thing that happened then was she watched the response of people to the earthquake. She didn't see FEMA show up. She didn't see big government helping. She saw unions and churches helping. And we have on the left side, the unions figured out how to keep the town, this is in Oakland, how to keep the town safe and making sure that people don't jack up their prices for rebuilding, because trade unions. And they said, we're not going to raise our prices for the period of this rebuild. And on the other hand, the churches, you see there, it's small there, but maybe later you could go up and take a look at it. We actually have all the corporal works of mercy up there. And she saw churches responding with the works of mercy and asked her mother, why can't people treat each other like this all the time? For me, that's the seeds of the Catholic worker right there. So let's time jump to September 1916. Dorothy lands in New York City and wants to become a journalist, just like her family. Her father said, newspaper room is no place for a woman. Not only that, she thinks that he called all the editors of the New York papers saying to tell her this when she got there. Because every time she applied for a job, they said, newspaper is no place for a woman. But Dad didn't call the socialist papers. Next slide. So Dorothy got a job with the New York Call, which was one of the socialist papers, as a reporter, known as a girl reporter back then. They were so rare, but a woman could get in places that a male reporter couldn't. And she would meet poor families, often interviewing the mothers about their lives and report it. Here she's saying, Ms. Salvatore, you say your family eats dog food to get by? And she says, oh, I used to cook up the chicken feet for the dog, but now we have to eat them ourselves. We have 6 children. It's not so bad if you cut the nails off and boil them for a long time. And so she writes about this, and here's a little, if you remember the movie, The Front Page, we thought we'd do this, kind of a tribute to that. Here's the headline: Mr. J.D. Rockefeller, richest man in the world at the time, 26 Broadway. Here's a family living on dog food. So you can see the tone of this is kind of sensational. This is the old yellow journalism, the muckraking, to kind of tell the stories of people living in poverty for regular folks to see what's actually happening. Next slide, please. So Dorothy begins this life as a reporter, and she begins to make friends with other writers. And she begins to go where all the writers are hanging out. A bar called the Golden Swan. It was a restaurant called the Golden Swan, and the bar part of it was nicknamed the Hellhole. And there was all kinds of just wild crowd there. There were gangsters as well as writers. And Dorothy really hung out with a lot of writers, and she met someone who you might have heard of, Eugene O'Neill, playwright. Some folks have heard of him, a really famous American playwright. She gets to become friends with him, and Eugene O'Neill right there. If you notice, there's no flat screen TVs with sports on them. What's that? Well, it's kind of a question I never thought to ask. What did people do for entertainment in bars before TVs were everywhere? Well, this group was very talented, and they would perform for each other. Um, and Eugene O'Neill is reciting The Hound of Heaven, famous poem about someone being pursued by God. Here's an atheist who feels like he's being pursued by God. Isn't that an interesting way of looking at life? And he would recite this poem on demand. People would say, Gene, do it again, do it again. It was a very popular thing. So Dorothy got into this world, and she thinks, this is such a great, this is better than college. You know, she dropped out of college, so she's 19 years old. She says, this is better than college. I'm with the best writers in the country, and we have this great scene here. And this is often referred to as Dorothy Day's bohemian lifestyle. You know, she stayed up late having beers with her friends, talking about building a better world. Okay. Now it went south. One of Eugene O'Neill's high school classmates got dumped by his girlfriend, and he drank a vial of heroin and died right there in her arms. He was an OD, and she saw something that just broke her heart. You see in the left panel, there's people running out the door. Everyone ran out the door when they saw Lewis fall over. They ran out the door except for Dorothy and the young man's sister. And that broke her heart, you know, and she's asking, where's Gene? You know, she confronted Gene later, and he said, it's not my mess. Nobody really, and so, you know, you've been staying up late, you know, several nights a week, talking about building a better world with a group of people, and then one of their own ODs, and they run. So this was a very traumatic event for her. Next slide. And this is when she became a nurse, because she felt like, I'm going to stop talking about building a better world, and I'm going to do something about it. The Spanish flu, you know, is everywhere. And so she became a nurse. And while she was doing that, she met another journalist named Lionel Moyse, who's a fast-talking, charismatic, good-looking guy, and fell in love with him. And that's when she had the abortion. She became pregnant, and Lionel said, it's either me or the baby. I don't think she was the first or last woman to hear that from a boyfriend. It says either me or the baby. So she had an abortion, and it didn't go well. She had complications, and she thought she'd never be able to have children again. So it was a very traumatic incident that left her, ended up having 2 suicide attempts. You know, those of you who have read The Long Loneliness and you're trying to think, where is this in Long Loneliness? She says something that writers used to be able to get away with. She says, the next 3 years were hard. Of these years, there is not much to say. I mean, you know, she has the abortion. She 2 suicide attempts. Today, that would be the front and center. It would be like my traumas. But back then, she just thought, that's painful. I don't want to talk about it anymore. So, she after the abortion, she's got those complications. She's looking for Lionel. She doesn't find him. But now the interesting thing, and I have to warn you about something. Whatever your romantic intentions in life, don't do a writer wrong, because they will write about you. Dorothy writes a novel called The 11th Virgin that's a fictionalized version of her life about an idealistic young woman journalist who, et cetera, et cetera, and the man who broke her heart and so forth. And she really is able to get on that journey to healing partly by writing that novel. Then a really weird thing happens. She wants it to do well. It gets reviewed, kind of mixed reviews, like in the New York Times said it was a little too adolescent, but it sold pretty well, respectably. And Hollywood got interested, and they bought the movie rights for $5,000, which, back in the 1917, 18, 19, that was a lot of money. And a friend of hers says, look, Dorothy, I've seen how you go through money. You need to buy a house with this. So she buys a little house on Staten Island, back in the days when Staten Island looked like Cape Cod. And it was in a community that included a lot of artists and radicals. And she meets the love of her life, Forster Batterham, who introduced her. He is someone who sees himself as a radical. Maybe you might even she calls him an anarchist in her memoir. Robert Ellsberg has said that his anarchism seemed to only extend to not wanting to get married. So, the guys in this story are a little sketchy, but love of her life. And he introduces her into nature. She calls him a biologist. He sells gauges in Manhattan for machines and stuff, but she calls him a biologist because he's so into it. You can see on the right, they have these specimens hanging up that he's found, and he's great showing her the, wonders of the sea, a little seahorse, and they're eating eels for dinner and that kind of stuff. So it's a real, almost seafaring life. But Dorothy becomes pregnant again. And this time she says, no, this time I'm having the baby. And she feels so grateful to God for allowing her to have a child after that, all those complications. She is so grateful that she says, I want to become Catholic because it's the church of the poor. Now, Dorothy had always had religious impulses. The socialists and anarchists that she was hanging out with used to have a joke. Dorothy Day would make a terrible communist because she's always cornering you at a party and wanting to talk about God. So, this is not the beginning of her religious impulses. So they get a big fight. Dorothy says, we need to get married. He says, it's against my principles. And they get to an impasse where she sees she has to make another one of these choices. It's me or the church now. And she chooses the church and she kicks him out. So it's the beginning of another painful period for her because she's happy to have become Catholic and now to have a faith life that's being nurtured by tradition. But at the same time, and I don't know if this ever happened to you, she goes to church and she finds nobody that shares her concerns. Like she wants to fight for the rights of working people and low income people, and she's just not finding anybody cares about that in her church. So it's actually a kind of a depressing time for her. So time jump back to the Hunger March of 1932. Dorothy has been trying to pull these two worlds together for 5 or 6 years by being a Catholic journalist who covers radical movements. But she's getting to the end of a rope with that. It still feels unsatisfying. And she goes to this, this is a march. It's kind of a famous march in radical history, and it's run by communists. So she sees friends of hers that she still, likes and everything, but she says, "This is not my world now. I'm not part of this world anymore, and I'm not going back. How can I take my call to help working and low income people? How can I take that call and live my faith at the same time?" After the march, she goes to the Shrine of the Immaculate Conception, which is still being built. That's why you see scaffolding there. But the basement church, they call it the crypt church, but that's kind of scary. So I'm going to call it the basement church. She goes to the basement church and prays. And she asks, you can't see, it's not large enough for you to see it, but here I am, Lord. Show me a way to use the gifts you gave me for my fellow workers and the poor. She prays that prayer. She gets on a bus, goes back to New York to the apartment she shares with her brother, who's 18 now, and his wife, Tessa. Tessa greets her at the door and says, your daughter Tamar has the measles now, and there's this odd Frenchman who wants to talk to you. This is the entrance of Peter Morin. Dorothy prays to find a way to use her gifts for poor and working people. And then there's this strange French guy in the apartment saying, "Let's start a movement together." And he tells her, "We'll have a newspaper. You have my attention now." She wants to be a journalist. And then we'll have three other things. We'll have roundtable discussions. We'll bring people together to talk through the issues of the day. That way, workers can become scholars. We'll have houses of hospitality where people in need who need a place to stay can come, just like the church had in the Middle Ages. And then finally, farming communes. He used to say, this is during the Depression. He used to say, there is no unemployment on the land. Anyone who's unemployed, they can work for their food on these farming communes. And the farming communes will produce food that we can bring to the houses of hospitality. He's got it all thought out. And the thing about Peter Morin is he'll talk to anybody about this. He will try to recruit anybody. As you can see in the previous slide, whoop, back. Yeah, previous slide. He tries to convert the doctor while they're waiting for Dorothy to show up. And this is kind of his style. So it's kind of like this crazy guy who has exactly what she's been looking for. And so they develop a friendship. And Peter says, you know what? Because Dorothy grew up nominally Protestant. She was baptized Episcopalian. She had Methodist friends who would bring her to church when she'd do a sleepover, that kind of thing. So she knew a little bit about the Bible. But Peter said, you know nothing about the saints, and you know nothing about the teachings of the popes. I will teach you. And then she says, well, I'm kind of tired right now, and my daughter's sick. Can we do this another time? He says, I'll see you in the morning. So he's very persistent. So they start this movement. They start the houses of hospitality. And there's lots of things that happen in those early years that are really exciting. One that I wanted to mention that often gets not told. These are the Sisters of Bethany, who back then they were described as reformed prostitutes. Today we would call them human trafficking survivors. And this group of survivors created a religious order. And one of their missions was to help women get out of prostitution. And the Catholic Worker became a safe house for women who were being rescued. And then they would go in the Catholic Worker for a period while they figured out how to put their lives together. So the Sisters of Bethany were big donors back then because they saw that it fit into their mission. And the paper, as you can see, grew from 20,000 copy circulation in 1933 to 190,000 in 1938. At the time of the Depression, Catholics weren't really talking a lot about the economy, despite the teaching that goes back to Rerum Novarum in the 19th century. But Dorothy need for that. And even the title of the paper, Catholic Worker, I always thought that was a strange title, but it was meant to be a competitor to the communist daily worker. That Dorothy saw this, she had been in those movements, but she believed that what the church had was better. And it was a little, poke in the eye a little bit. Peter Morin said, we're going to call it the Catholic Radical. And then he went off to do something, and she put out the first issue, Catholic Worker. So it didn't take long for her to stand up to her mentor. So in the 30s, there was a lot of coverage of strikes. Now we're getting near the end of this United Auto Workers strike, and we saw the writers strike, and we saw the picketing and all that. Well, back in those days, if you were striking, it might mean you get shot in the back by the Chicago police. A little bit more dangerous back then. So Dorothy wrote, and remember, this is a newspaper that's going into churches all over the country and even the world. They end up going on ships and being brought to India and places like that. But I'll just read you just the first few lines of her article. July 1937, page 1. Have you ever heard a man scream as he was beaten over the head by 2 or 3 policemen with clubs and cudgels? Have you ever heard the sickening sound of blows and seen people with their arms upraised, trying to protect their faces, stumbling blindly to get away, falling and rising again to be beaten down? Did you ever see a man shot in the back, being dragged to his feet by policemen who tried to make him stand while his poor body crumpled, paralyzed by a bullet in the spine? This is the kind of stuff that used to happen in strikes. And Dorothy was bringing that story to the church. She also very strongly began to campaign against nuclear weapons. I mentioned World War II. There was a big drop in circulation because of World War II, the fact that she opposed it. People would leave the Catholic Worker and enlist in the Marines. It was that kind of situation. People at one time thought the movement would just disappear, but she hung in there, and then it began to grow. People began to be concerned about the threat of nuclear war. Right there, what we're picturing is the drills they had in the New York City, and it was against the law not to run to a fallout shelter. You might have seen this in Seton Hall students' dorm rooms. These fallout shelter signs. I don't know if that still happens. I had one in my room. They're all gone now. The Gen Xers took them all. Dorothy had this very interesting nonviolent protest. It was against the law unless you were in Yankee Stadium. If you were in Yankee Stadium during a game and the air raid sirens went off, you were allowed to stay in Yankee Stadium. Otherwise, you had to go to a fallout shelter. So the protest, we'll have a picnic. We'll have a picnic. She called these rehearsals for doomsday. The idea if a hydrogen bomb was dropped on Manhattan, the idea that, you would just go in this fallout shelter and everything would be fine was crazy. And so they did these for many years. It's part of her arrest record. We got some raised eyebrows from the Vatican, when they heard she'd been arrested 6 times. That's not common for saints. So Dorothy took part in these, and you can see there were some very interesting people that were accompanying him. Here's Bayard Rustin, who ended up being the organizer for the March on Washington for Martin Luther King. It's also not as well known. He worked with the African nations in protesting French, you imagine this, French testing of nuclear weapons on African soil. Go figure, yeah, it's good enough for them, but not for us. So she was a good friend with Bayard Rustin. She also got involved with the civil rights movement. She got very deeply covered the Koinonia Farm. I don't know if people have ever heard of that, but it was an interracial farm in Americus, Georgia, birthplace of Habitat for Humanity, and some of the same people were involved. And they were being attacked and raided by their neighbors who had bought produce from them in the past because they were an interracial community. And that's Reverend Clarence Jordan, who wrote a translation of the Bible in Southern language called the Cotton Patch Gospel. Next slide, please. And that was actually when Dorothy almost got killed, almost was assassinated. One of these neighbors came by as they were standing watch. They told Dorothy, please don't stand watch with our people because it's really dangerous. But she insisted on it. So she stayed up all night with one of the women and they sang Baptist hymns. And Dorothy taught her the Liturgy of the Hours. And she brought her accordion with her in the station wagon. And then this attempt to kill them happened. They both ducked well enough. The car was totaled, but they both walked out unscathed. Next slide, please. So time jump to the 60s. You can see Dorothy's aged a bit here. 60s and 70s, Dorothy was deeply involved with mentoring the generation of Catholic workers protesting the Vietnam War. And this incident here in Union Square in New York was several Catholic workers, along with a couple other men who weren't, burned their draft cards in Union Square. It's a very famous, Tom Cornell was one of them. And that was really one of the issues at the heart of the Catholic worker in the 60s and 70s. Dorothy had no patience with the hippies, though. Abby Hoffman famously said that Dorothy Day was the first hippie, but she had nothing to do with that. She said, here she's talking to Stanley Wisniewski, who's a character we have throughout the book. He starts out in the Catholic worker. He's 17 years old. It's like the first year of the Catholic worker. And he said, I was just trying to help an old lady carry a typewriter across the street. Dorothy's like 34 or 35 at that point, but he stayed through like 4 decades until his death. And he said he just would tell people, I've been here ever since I helped that old lady, but I haven't decided whether I'm going to stay or not 40 years later. So he says, we've always had freeloaders at the Catholic Shirker because they always had people who didn't do anything. It's like Pope John the 23rd. They asked him, how many people work at the Vatican? And he said about half. But Dorothy says, but Stanley, they didn't use drugs and get the girls pregnant. They're as bad as those beats in the 1950s. So Dorothy's seen this movie before. She didn't like the beatniks either. And this is a PAX conference, which is the forerunner to Pax Christi. Dorothy was one of the co-founders of Pax Christi, among all the other amazing things she did in her life. And you have, Swami Satchidananda, you have nuns, you have hippies, you have guy playing the violin, you have everything. And then Stanley's over here saying, come on, Kate, let's try to figure out who the FBI agent in this group is. So she was constantly harassed by the FBI. And we have a nice collage of her FBI file in the most interesting quotes from it. It was about 300 pages in all. Dorothy begins to develop some heart problems. She becomes kind of semi-retired, but she does make it out to California for one last demonstration, 1973 with United Farm Workers. And you may have seen the famous photo with the sheriff's deputies surrounding her with, it's close up on the big guns. And there's this frail old lady sitting in a chair. That's one. If you Google Dorothy Day photographs, you'll see the original one. I think it won an award too. And then also she would visit with some old friends. Anyone recognize her friend there? Right to the right. Who is it? Mother Teresa. Mother Teresa. Time magazine had a cover story, one issue in the 70s called Living Saints. And it had Mother Teresa on the cover, and it had Dorothy on the inside. And Dorothy didn't like that too much. She did not like being called a saint. You may have heard her most famous quote is don't call me a saint. I don't want to be dismissed that easily. And, it's kind of interesting. Just be careful what sarcastic remarks you make because they may become your most famous quote. And get back one that we wanted to share some of the kind of the humor of the Catholic worker because of the cartoon format. One of the guests said, "You got a cigarette?" to Mother Teresa. And Mother Teresa says, "No, I don't smoke." And then the guest says, "Then what good are you?" Okay. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'm going to share a little bit. Don't call me a saint. So here we go with the sainthood process. First of all, sainthood, Robert Ellsberg, you may have read some of his work, Give Us This Day and so forth. He's a real expert on saints, as well as being someone who lived for 5 years with Dorothy. He says, sainthood is not a Catholic Hall of Fame. It's about the cloud of witnesses in heaven who continue to influence our lives and help us. So recognizing Dorothy as a saint is not putting her in the Hall of Fame. Also, when she said, "Don't call me a saint," she was responding to a reporter who said, "How does it feel to be a living saint?" So you can imagine why that sarcasm was there. She hated all that. She was a very humble person. So sainthood process, you start out as a candidate, servant of God. That's the stage Dorothy is at now. We collected 2/3 of a ton of evidence to prove she lived a life of heroic virtue. Remember, we weren't writing a paper. This isn't like the term paper from heaven or the term paper from hell, depending on how you look at it. It is evidence for a trial. And the trial isn't about, is she innocent, is she guilty? It's about, did she live a life of heroic virtue? After that, the miracles come in. Miracle trials. If someone says a miracle happened, well, let's put it on trial. And the trial determines whether it's a miracle or not. First one, blessed or beatified. Your title is blessed. Second one, you're canonized. You become a saint. So that's the basic, those are the basics of the process. What we had to do in the 7 years we were collecting evidence, get testimonies of people who knew her. There were a lot of, in that 70s crowd, a lot of young people who are in their 60s and 70s now. So despite the fact that she died in 1980, there's a lot of people around who still knew her, and many of whom have gone on to amazing careers in the church. Second, 2 theologians review all of her published writings. So if you'd like to be a saint, don't publish a lot. It's a lot of work. We had to get, this is over 10,000 pages of stuff, articles, books, pamphlets, all kinds of writings of Dorothy Day that were published. Then all diaries and her most important letters have to be cataloged and copied and transcribed. And please don't believe anybody who tells you in the olden days they had good handwriting, that kind of stuff. It's just not true. It's terrible handwriting. We had 125 volunteers transcribe her diaries. Her diaries add up to over 10,000 pages too. Testimonies of current bishops and a few sisters as well about, well, what does she mean today? Folks like Cardinal Dolan, who's the petitioner, but also many other bishops gave testimony. And then finally, additional supportive material, which I'll show you. Maybe go ahead. One more. One more. I'm sorry. Okay, here we go. Additional supportive material. Who would have thought there's a character in Batman designed after Dorothy Day? Her name is Dr. Leslie Tompkins. And to make it short, I'm a comic book guy, so I could do a whole thing on Batman's origin and all that. But, Batman, you may know from the movies or your own reading that Batman comes out of a horrible trauma. The young Bruce Wayne watches his parents being murdered and then, becomes a crime fighter as a result. And what Denny O'Neil, who is a writer for DC Comics, what he went through, I think, was a little bit like Herod. Remember Herod listening to to the Baptist. He was very disturbed by him, but he liked to listen to him. Denny O'Neil used to go to the Catholic Worker and, take part in helping the guests and everything and listen to the talks and participate in the discussions. He was scripting a very violent comic book. And he began to think, what am I doing? This is really violent, the stuff I'm doing. And what she's saying sounds like the truth to me. And he became a pacifist, but stayed writing Batman. And so he had to, how do I put this together? Think about that dilemma. Do you just quit? You're doing well. He's a well-known comic book writer for Batman. I mean, that's a good gig. So what he did was introduce a conscience of Batman, who was Dr. Leslie Tompkins, who, after Bruce Wayne's parents were murdered, kind of took him in. When they developed the backstory even more, it turned out she went to medical school with Bruce Wayne's father, and anyway, was friend of the family. So she kind of took him under her wing, and she knows he's Batman, and she doesn't approve of what he's doing, the violence of it. So she's teach him to go in a more pacifist way. And you see Batman there, you and those like you're the hope of Crime Alley. I mean, that's Denny O'Neil talking about Dorothy Day. In the 90s, they had her yelling at him about child endangerment for what he's doing with Robin. You think about it, it's so obvious. No one said it before. So let's go back. Heroic virtue. Okay. Oh, let's go back one more, and I'll just give a quick thing. I know we're running out of time for the presentation part, but let's see. Okay, where's the one on heroic virtue? That's okay. Back one. There you go. Okay. So what does heroic virtue mean? Okay. Think about the cardinal virtues that Apostle Paul talks about in his letters: prudence, temperance, fortitude, justice. The logical virtues, again, Paul: faith, hope, love. Did she live love heroically? Did she live faith heroically? Did she live justice heroically? Prudence? And you get the idea. Those are the questions that the trial hinges on. And one more ahead. I think that's the one. Yeah, this one. Heroic virtue. For me, I'll finish with this. Heroic virtue happens when, remember Forster, the guy she kicked out? Well, they stayed in touch. He's Tamar's father. He wasn't like a deadbeat dad or anything. He would send them money and he would visit and they would do stuff. He calls her from Florida and says, Nanette, his partner of 25 years. So this is the next girlfriend, was Nanette. They stay together 25 years without getting married. She's dying of cancer. I hear you take care of people. Could you help me take care of her? The thing I think of first, I mean, anybody who's been in a relationship that has exes, think about your ex calling you and saying, will you take care of my current partner for me? I just, when I was doing this at St. John's, there was one young woman's face, like her jaw just dropped. She was like, it was like WTF was written over her head, Dorothy does it. And as Nanette is dying, here's another atheist radical. She asked to be baptized. This is the witness that Dorothy offered. So I'll close with that. If that's not heroic virtue, I don't know what is. So let's take a moment and, just for a moment, think what was most interesting to you as we went through this and you heard the story and the sainthood process. And what's something you'd like to learn more about? Just take a moment and think about that. Oh, we're not done. Could you put on the first slide? Let's have some reactions. I mean, I find I learn a lot of these kind of conversations too. People pick up things about Dorothy that maybe I haven't seen. And oh, we got a question or comment right from the back.
Yeah, I mean, kind of the heroic virtues. I was kind of, what example will it give us about prudence? Because she was very radical. She was, outspoken, was all over the place. So where will you example of prudence? Because from the definition of prudence is like you're careful of what you say at a given time, where you go, with whom you mingle with. But I don't, from all you've said, and we've been reading her, I don't see that restriction or kind of, so where will you place her in prudence?
I think prudence is more than what you don't do. It's also that you choose a path that's going to be the most helpful, that is going to be most likely to bring about the kingdom of God. And as you were asking that question, I started to think of some examples. One is around going to prison, that she was very thoughtful about encouraging some of the young men who opposed the Vietnam War, who wanted to, burn their draft cards and go to prison. She would counsel them, prison is not for everybody, because she had seen guys who would do that, during the Korean War and come out entirely broken men. So the most extreme tactics, she would talk to people about maybe not doing that. That would be one example. Another would be in her selection of leaders. And here, back to Robert Ellsberg's story, he's written about many times. I think in America Magazine, if you want to read about it, just do Robert Ellsberg Dorothy Day, and it'll come up in the other things there. But he was a 19-year-old college dropout who went to the Catholic Worker in 1975. Daniel Ellsberg is actually his father, which doesn't figure into this story, but it's an interesting part of his story. But he said, that when he got there, she would kind of size you up. Because a lot of people came to the Catholic Worker, particularly in the 70s, that living saint decade, they would come to the Catholic Worker and say, oh, this is the greatest moment of my life meeting you. She hated that. She would be like, oh, you see her, get her away from me. Just make sure she doesn't get to talk to me ever, or watch out for him, all right? Because he's just doing this worshiping me instead of worshiping Jesus stuff. And so she didn't like that at all. So Robert found that, the way to get to know Dorothy was to start mopping the floor, to start cutting the carrots for the soup and that kind of thing. So Robert was just, doing that kind of stuff, the things that you do to help keep a soup kitchen and a house of hospitality going. 6 months into it, she says, Robert, I'd like you to be editor of the paper. He's 19-year-old college dropout. She saw something in him, and the prudence of that might have been questioned at the time. Robert is now the publisher for Orbis Books, the publishing arm of the Maryknolls. And it's what she saw in him and then giving him an opportunity to use his gifts. And I think that is probably one of the best ways in which Dorothy exercised prudence. In the language of the saints, they often call that reading souls, which is a very cosmic and almost magical kind of sounding words. Like I mentioned this to a neighbor of mine. Because he's like, what do you do for a living? I was like, okay, well, it's a long story, And I talked about Dorothy and I said, well, she could read souls. And he said, what does that mean? And I said, well, this is he says, oh, she was a good judge of character. And it's kind of maybe the secular version of that. But for Dorothy, there were all kinds of leadership decisions that she had to make. along the way. And I think that's a sign of prudence. But thanks, that's a great question. Other questions? Yes.
Two and they're different from each other. So you can either answer both or choose one. One is if you can talk a little bit more about her relationship with her child and conversion. That's so interesting to me that it was that experience that kind of pushed her towards faith. And then unrelated question, you mentioned that she was always a pacifist. And even in World War II, which, you know, many of us growing up in this country hear of as like a just war. So I just wanted you to see if you could explain that to us a little bit. Like, how did she engage with just war theory, or which I don't know. I don't know. I mean, I just know about from teaching in the Corps. And I don't know, you know, like that, I kind of was struggling with that a little bit. Yeah.
Yeah, those are two great points. Let's start with Tamar. Because some of before we finish, I should give you the objections to her canonization. And, you know, she was a communist, you know, there's that, which Cardinal Dolan always breaks up the crowd when he says, because, you know, Cardinal Dolan's a historian, and his dissertation was on the Catholic action movements of the 1950s. So, like, he really knows what he's talking about when it comes to church movements and even secular movements. And so he, you know, people say, she was a communist. And he says, well, you know, she was really more of an anarchist. And the whole room will start laughing like he's just made a joke, you know, but he's saying, you know, like the idea that this person who didn't believe in government helping the poor, she was against Social Security, which is another one of those almost World War II like things of like all the progressives that love her, they hear that and they're like, really? Most successful anti-poverty program in the United States history, you know, maybe world history, went from 50% unemployed elderly to 25% elderly immediately. So the bad mom theory is she left her child and went all over the country on speaking tours. She must not have cared about her child. Now, Tamar has said this, like, the people entrusted to my care were wonderful. They were always like couples in the movement that had kids of their own and they'd watch her and all that. And besides that, if this was a man,
Right.
would this be a question at all? She got good child care and she did what she could. She always struggled with what's the right thing to do. You know, things would happen in the Catholic worker, like guests would get jealous of the fact that Tamar got so much attention for her mom, and they'd smash up her school projects. You know, you think these are like mentally ill, homeless people, and they love Dorothy, and then suddenly there's a daughter, this pick that, you know, and it was really hard on her sometimes because of that. So for Tamar, she said she was, you know, by the end of her life, she was no longer Catholic, but she said, the one thing about the Catholic Church I loved was the Catholic worker and the people I met. And she kept a lot of those things in her rural life in Vermont after that. Did I answer that first part okay? Okay. On the second part about the pacifism, I have to tell you, you know, one of the reasons that I never got involved in the Catholic worker is that I'm more of a strict just war guy myself. That, you know, Bono says about Christianity, you know, from U2, the band U2, he says, I'm a fan, but I'm not in the band. And I always felt that way about Dorothy Day and the Catholic worker. Dorothy Day had some extreme beliefs that if you go back to the ministry of Jesus, you can see there's a case for that. She said, blessed are the peacemakers. We are not supposed to solve our problems with violence. She was objecting to Franco in the Spanish Civil War. That's when the circulation started to drop, because there were some Catholic leaders who were saying, you know, Francisco's a Catholic, and Franco's a Catholic, we should support him as he's setting up a fascist state in Spain. So Dorothy, from the beginning, was opposed to fascism, was writing about Hitler. And so by the time the war happened, she had been warning people about fascism and Father Coughlin and people like that for years. So it wasn't like I told you so. It was just violence brings more violence. Now, I may not be the best person to defend her extreme pacifism. I wrote a book called Solidarity Will Transform the World, Stories of Hope from Catholic Relief Services that includes a chapter on the Rwanda genocide. I interviewed the survivors who had forgiven each other over this. And that's when I started to believe with God, all things are possible, to really believe it when I saw that. Would we have saved 800,000 people's lives if President Clinton had ordered some kind of US intervention into that or a UN intervention into that? A lot of lives would have been saved. And President Clinton talks about it now. It's his biggest regret as president is not doing anything about that. So it's a hard dilemma to. It was weird when I was in graduate school. I learned there's actually an academic term called the hard sayings of Jesus. I mean, I think anybody could come up with that. But oh, yeah, tell us. You want to come up and just share? Okay.
Teenager, live in Bayonne, New Jersey. I'm my sister, and it's 18, so I can drink in New York as well. Say to my mom, up to go into the city. My mom, other trans, said, of course, girls, go to the Catholic work first. So first we go to Mary House. It was either Easter or Easter.
Yeah, it's that second, I think. Next to the Hells Angels. Yeah.
And then as I became older, got copies of the newspaper on a regular basis. My partner and I would go into New York, especially on Thanksgiving, to help with the serving of that wonderful. And so we were really deeply connected, deeply committed.
Well, let me ask you a question. When you met her, what were some of your impressions just as a young person meeting her? Hmm.
We got copies of the newspaper. So my impression was that she was simple, honest, and profound altogether, and lived the gospel. And having come from a Catholic background, my mother was quite a liberal Catholic. This was really important for us young women to see this woman does the gospel in ways that I had never seen before.
That's a great story. And one thing about it is that it's consistent with everything that we heard from people of that era. It's a wonderful story. Mary House is still there. The neighborhood is changing. It's becoming a wealthy neighborhood. So it's kind of tricky. Like I used to work at the National Pastoral Life Center in Manhattan, where the Holy Name Center for Homeless Men was. And there was this big controversy because the diocese was terminating it or moving it and going to build the Sheen Center, which is a new evangelization center now. And it was, oh, how terrible. They don't care about the poor. The poor had moved out. So I used to, when I first worked there, I used to step over homeless guys to get in my office. And then by the end, they were commuting from the outer boroughs for the services there. The Catholic worker is dealing with those same questions. And I think there is such a sense of history because it's the last place Dorothy lived. And in fact, they've kept, as best as they can, they've kept her room just as it was. If you're ever down there, introduce yourself and ask, is it possible for me to see Dorothy's room? And you go up there and you look and, yep, all the books are from the 70s and before, and her pictures are there and that kind of thing. They are dealing with a problem where at one point some people have been taking souvenirs. So they're in conversations with Manhattan College's Dorothy Day Center to actually move the room to a room at the university. Yes, sir.
No, you mentioned she was against Social Security.
Yeah.
That's right. I totally understand that. We have to return. I think big government, really, imagine just dropping big government away. I think Dorothy Day just inspired me, Day, wherever you are in heaven, that we drop all big government. Imagine people helping each other. You're always going to have those people that hate each other. But here, imagine that movement. If that happened, what a paradigm shift that would be. And now I see what that means. To be against Social Security, people would help each other and themselves, and we don't need any government. Real anarchy, voluntaristic anarchy. I think that's what she was all about.
Okay, right there, you will understand why different corners of the church like Dorothy Day. There are more conservative voices that like her because of the whole role of government. There are more progressive folks who like the anti-war and like the idea of our obligation to the poor and so forth. And there are radicals who are outside of that are really committed to building the kind of society that we're talking about, that transcend left and right, because it's about living what Jesus taught and taking that seriously. So when we did back in the process when we were gathering the testimonies of the bishops, we were really interested to find bishops who were known as being real conservatives, who don't support a big role of government, but who do support Catholics getting out there and getting their hands dirty and working with the poor. So it is quite an interesting group of people that support her cause for sainthood. We're getting near the end of our time, so I'll just tell you where things are right now. We sent as I said, 2/3 of a ton of paper, and we had a closing mass on the Feast of the Immaculate Conception, which was when Dorothy made that prayer in the Shrine of the Immaculate Conception. It was December 8th. So we thought that was a great time to do that. And Cardinal Dolan preached, and all the evidence was on the altar. Now, our postulator, that's your lawyer, in church law, canon lawyer, it's called a postulator. He said, well, why don't we just have one box symbolically there? And I said, my mom's going to be there. I wanted to see all of this stuff on the stage. And he said, okay. So it's funny, but it looked great. All the news outlets had pictures of it and everything. So that, a few weeks later, DHL came and picked up all those boxes, brought them to the Holy See, and then they sent us a bill for receiving it. That's how they keep the lights on in the dicastery for the causes of saints. They bill you for things. And then a month later, they sent us another bill saying that they had opened the boxes. So I thought that was interesting. You get a bill when they get the boxes, and you get a bill when they open the boxes. We're saying, like, what's the next bill going to be for? Filing the. So right now, from what I've heard, because I no longer work there, I just decided after 7 years, I was pretty fried. It's time for someone else to do the next stage, the miracles and whatnot. So we checked, and they have not assigned a staff person yet. This is called a relator. And so the relator then works with the postulator to produce a book that summarizes all the evidence. So it'd be like 250-page book to summarize 40,000 pages of evidence. So that needs to happen. What Cardinal Dolan is going to ask for a birthday present, we've got Dorothy's birthday next week, for a 125th birthday gift, he's going to ask the Pope to assign a staff person. because that's the next step. Things move slowly over there, so we're trying to just, whatever the next step is, move it along, move it along. The Pope may have said Dorothy was one of 4 great Americans, but that doesn't mean that department responsible for looking through this stuff is going to make it a priority unless he says, make it a priority, put it on top of the pile. So thank you so much for being a part of today. Really grateful. And the book will be out in September of next year.
Thank you, Jeff. That was wonderful. Thanks, everybody, for coming. To eat the food and a lot of food, help yourself, especially if you came in right before the talk and did get a second. This was just wonderful. Thank you.
Oh, that's amazing. Yes, it is.